And indeed, we are live. So, greetings, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for a very special webinar following the very important American elections. And we always say the American elections and not just the presidential elections because there were so many positions that were elected to throughout this country. If you were one township, you'd be electing Supreme Court judges. Another state would have proposals that people would have a ballot initiative signed up. All of these are very important to the entire American process. But it's, of course, all the things that we are watching constantly on our news feed, whether that's on social media or traditional media, that have as many people talking about this as I've ever seen in my lifetime. And so, for that benefit, UCCA has gathered together a couple of our dear, dear friends, including the journalist and editor Diane Francis, as well as a celebrated former military secretary Jerry Hulton, to speak with you tonight on a couple of topics. But hopefully, if we get all of our remarks in under an hour, we'd like to have a little bit of questions from you as well, to which I will direct you to the Q&A section to type questions in in that section on your Zoom screen. Or if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, I will do my best to gather those questions as well on social media. That way we can truly have an interactive discussion with our friends. However, before I turn to our expert panelists, I'm going to first turn it over to Michael Saukiel. For those of you who aren't familiar, Michael is not only the president of UCCA as of October of 2024, he was also had a very historic run as a president of UCCA 20 years ago. And boy, did we have an interesting time 20 years ago. This is not the first go around for a chaotic time in American politics. To that end, since his time as president the first time, Michael is also familiar to many of you as the director of the UNIS office, the Ukrainian National Information Service, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and therefore he is always in contact, usually in person, visiting members of the Senate and the Congress, making sure that Ukraine's message at least has a voice in his person. So, Michael, I'm going to ask you to address our people first.
Excellent. Andrei, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for moderating this particular panel. To our guests, Diane, and to Jerry, thank you for being with us, and to all of our participants that are following online as well. It's an honor to bring everybody together for this particular webinar as a post-election analysis of U.S.-Ukraine relations. This is not just, as Andrei had mentioned, this is not just an American election in terms of a presidency, members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives. We had a whole host of governorships as well. We had a whole host of mayors and local elections, which is also as important for us as a Ukrainian community, because as Tip O'Neill, as the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, said, all politics is local. And that's what we as an organized Ukrainian American community, that's what we as the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and its Washington office of the Ukrainian National Information Service count on you, the community, count on you in terms of your advocacy on the ground in your local communities to bring forth all of that information about Ukraine and the necessity of the United States as a strategic partner. And I mention that specifically because that gets forgotten and lost through the weeds at times, that the United States and Ukraine are a strategic partner. Therefore, many of the aspects of what we advocate in Washington, D.C., many of that aspects that we advocate on a local level have to be brought to that particular notion that this is a strategic partnership. This is for the benefit of the national security interest of the United States of America, as well as for the country of Ukraine. With the conclusion of our campaign season, and this campaign season, many have said, basically began right after the 2020 election. But no matter what, at the conclusion of this campaign season, as of last week, we're also looking at what's coming ahead for U.S.-Ukraine relations. Next week, on November 19th, as a matter of fact, will be 1,000 days of Russia's brutal war, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If you think about the devastation, if you think about the untold loss of civilian and military personnel, loss of lives that Ukraine has had to endure for almost the past 1,000 days already, It's a travesty to think that this is a war that is happening in present time in the 21st century within the continent of Europe. But this is not, as we as Ukrainian Americans and all of our friends and all of our partners throughout the United States are saying, this is not just a war about Ukraine. This is a war about the war against democracy, the war against democratic values and democratic principles. So we must adhere to those particular notions in all the advocacy that we do. We have a bit of opportunity yet with the lame duck session of Congress that just came into session yesterday. They will be here until a few days prior to the Christmas holiday season to try to advance many of our interests. Many of our interests include the potential for an additional supplemental of assistance for Ukraine, as well as making sure that all of the presidential drawdown authority, which was passed in the last supplemental of the 6-month-long fought supplemental between October of 2023 and April of 2024, of $60 billion, of which many billions of dollars in terms of a presidential drawdown authority are yet to be allocated fully to Ukraine. This all needs to be done, and again, on behest of the community, in cooperation with and advocacy with our members of Congress and our elected officials, we need to push this as quickly as possible. Let's look as well in terms of security guarantees. We're going into an unknown time with the election of President-elect Trump and his new administration. We'll get into the weeds about that and an assessment about that from our two distinguished panelists. But thinking about what will come ahead and how Ukraine can position itself for the security guarantees that it needs to maintain the peace. Peace doesn't necessarily mean just the end of a kinetic war of firing missiles and rockets from one side into another side. This is the end of not just hostilities, but also everything when it comes to the dismantlement of the Russian threat. And that threat is its Russian imperialism, which has lasted for 400 years on Ukrainian territory, and obviously for many more centuries prior to that. So without taking too much time, I again thank you for your participation. I look forward to interacting with all of you, those that are on this particular webinar today, as we advance our interest in Washington, D.C., and information will be coming about potential advocacy events here in Washington, of which we look forward to seeing you in Washington. So thank you again. Andriy, over to you.
I'm here. I'm just balancing all these buttons at the same time. Here I am. Дякую, Mikhaile. You know, I went through all those titles of yours, and you mentioned all these things that we're doing today. And as I'm getting ready for doing this webinar, I'm putting on my jacket and my pin, and I'm like, well, of course, I got to switch over for November. It is Holodomor Genocide Awareness Month, of course, for a lot of our community, beginning in September with a great commemoration in Chicago that we saw online. Our community in Long Island organized a beautiful event at the Pamyatnik at Eisenhower Park. But we know that a lot of our communities are doing this throughout the country, and it is so important that you not only take the time out to commemorate these events in church, but use them as an opportunity to bring in local electeds, maybe brand new elected officials into your churches, into your commemoration ceremonies, and perhaps they'd be willing to issue a proclamation or an official acknowledgement of Ukraine's genocide of 1932, 1933. So I mentioned that because in going through all of Mikhailo's wonderful job positions, he also did a wonderful meeting of the Committee for Holodomor Awareness here in the United States, as he has chaired for a very long time. With that said, I'm going to turn over to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Jerry Halton. And Jerry, I've met you, I think, within the first month after the full-fledged invasion began in 2022. I've had the pleasure of being involved on numerous calls of Fighting Chance Ukraine, an initiative that you put together fairly quickly, given the resources that you had in your priors, as well as the need to support the front line of Ukraine, which is the Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine, the TDF, those people who weren't deployed to the front line, but they would be the backbone of any defense. And if you've ever had the chance to visit Bucha, Borodyanka, any of those places that were the key linchpin to whether Ukraine would have been completely taken over or not, you know how important talking to those people, talking to the importance of the Territorial Defense Forces are. And it's one of the great things that Jerry has a legacy, I would say, in your storied career, not just as an undersecretary of the United States Navy, not just in your corporate world, but this really is something that really made a meaningful difference, making sure to do fundraising for these basically everyday citizens who volunteer to be the frontline defender. So with that said, Jerry, I'm going to turn the floor over to you for the next few minutes to give us your thoughts following these elections, given the fact that I think most of everybody who's watching here is a little bit confused about what's going on.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody. And I feel a real kinship with what Ukraine has done. My grandfather came from Gotland, which, as you know, is off the eastern coast of Sweden and has felt itself threatened more than once by Russia and actually taken over by Russia. So there's a little blood in this for me, too. So this morning I did a meeting with folks in the United Kingdom on the election, all focused on the election. This now is more focused on the election's impact on Ukraine. I want to say I live in Ohio. Sherrod Brown's a friend. I know Rob Portman. I've been at more than one event over the last 2 or 3 years where we've worked together with UCCA, and we really care about this issue. I do think that what I'm going to talk about is bleaker than I would hope it would be at this time in this fight. But let me start with saying this. Why did we sign up for Fighting Chance Ukraine? I think 4 big reasons. We feel Ukraine is first, and the USA, as supporting democracy. That's critical. Secondly, Ukraine is full of bright and smart, innovative people. The United States identifies with them. I identify with them. I've run innovative universities. When I was undersecretary, actually, the Ukraine Navy came to New York City, and I came up to New York City and spent a day with the Ukraine Navy underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. So that was 1998. So there's a long relationship here. The third reason that I feel this is important is to reduce the threat of Russia seeking greater gains in Europe. And finally, I think it sends a signal to China to stay away from Taiwan or make Taiwan into an equivalent takeover. So there are a lot of reasons that we felt creating Fighting Chance was Ukraine was important. I want to compliment Peter Taluk and Tamara Alexei for their help in making this happen. And also all we enlisted a lot of key generals and admirals to support us and raise money across the country. We started out doing clothing and medical equipment, and we really have moved in the last 2 years to supporting drones, drone training schools, and demining equipment as being most important for the front line. And that's because we got those signals from the TDF that that's what was needed. So all these reasons I've described for supporting Ukraine, clearly Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the majority of both the Senate and the House have identified with and supported with actually billions of dollars. And that support has been really strong. But November 5th has really changed that. This has changed everything. You know this, but Trump won solidly across the nation. Trump's the one who threatened to leave NATO. Trump's the one that said he could settle the Ukraine war in a day. A settlement in a day is not likely a great settlement. J.D. Vance is vice president. Vance's words, we're getting easily $500 billion in the hole for the Ukraine conflict. Why? So that one of Zelensky's ministers can buy a bigger yacht. Then he goes on to say, I admire the brave Ukrainians, but let's not mistake the courage of Ukrainian troops on the ground with the fact that They have the most corrupt leadership in government in Europe and maybe the most corrupt leadership anywhere in the world. Those are not comforting words from the vice president. Sherrod Brown is gone. Rob Portman's gone, 2022. And Bernie Moreno's the U.S. Senator. Bernie Moreno's words. No, absolutely not. This is support for Ukraine funding because we've already spent $110 billion, another $60 billion to have a bloody stalemate that doesn't accomplish anything. What we need to do is we need to drive towards peace. We need to make certain that we put a peaceful settlement of that conflict and end it and move on and not fund another stalemate. There are some words to hold on to there because he talks about negotiating a peaceful settlement that truly ends the conflict, and hang on to those words and hold Bernie Moreno to that test. If you're in Ohio, you do have an election coming up in 2026 when the Vance seat is replaced, and in the meantime, you could lobby the governor for an appointment of a senator who supports Ukraine. I suspect that Mike DeWine supports Ukraine, but you got to give him backbone if it's going to happen. And plus, the 2026 election is a long ways off. 2025 is the year that counts. So you've been seeing the cabinet nominees coming down one by one by one by one. Have you found one of those names that gave you comfort that they would stand up and say, I'm in favor of greater support of Ukraine? I don't think there's one that meets that test. There were some in the first Trump administration, but they're long gone. The Senate, less likely to support. The House, less likely to support. Now, Mike Johnson's an interesting case. Remember, the Biden administration lobbied him really hard after 6 months of not funding Ukraine. They brought in the Secretary of Defense, they brought in the CIA, and they did a total blitz on Mike Johnson to support the last $60 billion, and they got it. That was amazing. They got it. But Mike Johnson now sitting with an entirely different Secretary of Defense, head of CIA, and so he's not going to get a briefing that supports funding Ukraine. He's going to get the opposite. So the House is probably lost too. So this is, in my view, pretty bleak. And I assume bleak for you. Even if some of you, for other reasons, may have voted for Trump, you're looking at what he's going to do on Ukraine as very troubling. So my view is Ukraine had faced three options. One, which is really off the table, was that the U.S. would up its support, increase its support, and take Russia on in an even stronger way. I think that one's gone off the table. Two, the U.S. continues what I would call the Biden approach, which is pretty significant support and weapon support, but always with a bit of a holdback, a bit of a limitation, or really not taking on the full force of the battle, which left Ukraine in a tough position, fighting, losses, etc., and not a clear way to get to victory. Of course, a nuclear threat hangs over all of that, so there's reasons why Biden did it, but that's the second option. Russia may be in trouble by 2026, but you got to get through 2025, and that's a long ways off. The third option is negotiations and a settlement, an armistice, a peace treaty, some type of end to the conflict. So the question you got to ask is, well, how hard will Trump negotiate for a settlement that really has teeth in it? How much land will Ukraine lose? And what will Ukraine bargain in return? Certainly security is a key issue. NATO membership for Ukraine, I think, is off the table with Trump. I mean, Trump says he may leave NATO, so he's not going to promote NATO membership. And then there's a question, well, how do you protect an incursion? You can look to like South Korea, North Korea. There's been 70 years of peace in South Korea, North Korea. A war was fought, a hard war, back and forth, etc. And that border survived. But the difference is that's a 160-mile border. We have about 20,000 troops still in South Korea. The border of Ukraine between the land and sea is nearly 1,600 miles. So it's 10 times the border. So that if you use 10 times, you got 200,000 troops at least. from the West, and that's unlikely to happen. So how you protect the border is going to be tough. You could use electronics. You should be able to use satellites and sensors and everything we've got to put in play now. And maybe you can eliminate needing so many people and you can actually protect the border against an incursion. The second big issue is going to be reconstruction. You've got to rebuild what's been destroyed. And fortunate thing is Ukraine is full of bright people, entrepreneurial people, opportunity to really build let's call it a 21st century economy. You got a very digital government, got a very digital banking system. You could take those as assets and really build what is the new way to have a country's economy operate. But it's a big bill to pay for that. And the question is, with the West having so much debt, the US being in debt so much, the rest of the debt around the world, the willingness to put up major debt may be an issue. Clearly, you would look to Europe to do some of that. And you also have the issue of how will you bring back the veterans and the fighters from the front line who essentially going to come back to Western Ukraine and find people living relatively reasonable lives while they were basically losing friends, comrades, etc. So there's going to be a healing have to take place between those who didn't fight, those who did fight. And that could be fairly stressful. So prospects for the U.S. continued support negotiating a favorable settlement, in my view, and funding reconstruction are bleak. So where should we be putting our efforts? I'll go through a quick list. I think NATO clearly, even if the U.S. were to leave, say Trump pulled out, NATO still is a well-oiled, well-designed fighting system. You'd have to get Europe to really step up, which really brings you to saying, if you've got friends in Europe, I'd start playing those cards really hard. Europe is the one that can put up the money, stiffen people's backbone, and give Ukraine what they need. But think of this, Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy. She's been very supportive of Ukraine, a bit of a surprise. But I was at dinner a month ago where Elon Musk sat beside Giorgia Meloni, introduced her at a speech. They were getting on like fast friends. So this means Trump tells Elon, call up Georgia and tell her, get on our side of the game. So can you depend on her? To be seen. Germany. Well, you know what's happened to Germany. Basically, the government's fallen, economy sucks. So you've got a problem there. United Kingdom, little military power, got a budget in trouble, new young government, maybe supportive. The Baltics, yes. Those three countries, clearly on the line, clearly going to be supportive. But how many dollars can they put on the table? How much force can they put on the table? You want them as your friends. You want to be strong, but they're in as much danger in many ways. They're next on the list after you. And so there's a problem there because they got to pay attention to themselves. The Nordic states, my grandfather's country, Sweden and Norway and Finland, you've seen a lot from them. But Finland's got, a border 500 miles long with Russia to protect. So you got to expect Finland to be busy. Poland, worth really courting, obviously, right in the line of sight. And the rest of other countries in Eastern Europe. Turkey, Erdogan stepped up. He's got relations with Russia and with Ukraine. He's supplying weapons to Ukraine. Erdogan could play a key role. And if you notice his geography, if Russia expands its coverage of the Black Sea, it only puts Turkey in a tighter vice where it's at. So I would pay attention to Erdogan. If you got friends, I would pursue him. So where else? Well, not Africa. My friends in Africa all say, we kind of like what Russia's doing, pushing the nose of the United States. The United States hasn't been that great for us. I don't see a lot of support out of Africa. South America sees itself miles from this conflict. Asia, though, is worth thinking about. Modi has said to Putin at a BRIC conference, this is not the era for war. India wouldn't mind playing a role of settling a major conflict. Ups their stature. They know both countries well. Israel, if Israel keeps weakening Iran, that's in Ukraine's benefit because it means Iran supplies less to Russia. Uh, China, arguably China might, because they don't want Russia to become a dominant and forceful player. I wouldn't bank a lot on China. I was in Shanghai a couple of weeks ago. Uh, they've got their own problems. They're thinking about their own things. I don't see them helping Russia a lot. They claim it's a, total friendship, but they're not acting like total friends, and that's to Ukraine's benefit. So if you've got Chinese friends or powerful places in China, I'd at least keep whispering in that ear. Uh, the rest of Asia, I was in Japan for a week last month also. Japan cares a lot about this, cares a lot about Ukraine. Japan knows that it's a signal to Russia because Japan's got the same problem. They're on the other side of the border. So I would, if you've got friends in Japan, I'd make them get in touch with them and be sure they're vocal and clear about their support. And they are a good source for reconstruction also. So in summary, where do I think things stand? I think everything's shifting quickly, very quickly. Trump is moving very fast. Secondly, I think it's the time to play Ukraine's cards now. I would up the ante as much as possible for bargaining position. It's not a time to say, let's save things for the summer of 2025. It could be over by the summer of 2025. Play the cards hard now and make Russia pay. Secondly, enlist, as I suggested, Europe, Turkey, Israel, India, Japan. Third, ask the question of what will Ukraine put on the table of value in exchange for security and reconstruction funding? And there are things, energy, talent, the digital economy, innovation. There's a lot to put on the table. A demonstration that democracy works. These would all be powerful things to put on the table to say, in return for that, we need security and we need reconstruction. And finally, since Trump's president and since he likes to do deals, give him the best cards he can to make a deal that's the best for Ukraine. That may not be the way it comes out. Trump may swing and say, okay, I'm going to show I'm strong. I'm going to back Ukraine harder. But the odds are he's going to say, let's do a deal. So let's give him enough that he does a deal that gives Ukraine the chance to not only survive, but to thrive as the bulwark against Russia's expansion. So with that, I look forward to Q&A because I love to hear what you got to say, but those are my thoughts.
Wow, Jerry, that's a lot to think about. We're really honored to have you here. Just because you brought up things I wasn't even expecting to think about here. So, and it takes me back to those late months of 2021, early months of 2022, when our community was yearning for information in much the same way. We saw the reports about war, and we had a number of wonderful webinars, one of which was with General Wesley Clark, who patiently explained to a lot of our community why somebody invades during a winter, which is counterfactual to maybe people who haven't served before. And so maybe if Ukraine has a bunch of Jerry Hultons in their corner, maybe we might see some hot action in the coming weeks.
Good. And I did run into Wesley Clark in New York recently, and he told me he thought Biden would settle the war before he left office.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow. That a little inside baseball. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch over to our next distinguished speaker. For some of you who may have seen some of the numerous conferences that UCCA has the honor of being co-sponsor, along with the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations or the American Foreign Policy Council, you may have seen Diane's impassioned explanations about how important this conflict is. But for many of you, you may just be a longtime reader of Diane because she has been in print for such a long time and always adding more through her writing than you would think after being such a distinguished writer for such a long time. Yes, she is currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, but you can get most of her writing directly if you subscribe to her Substack, which many independent contributors now do, because you can get the information directly. That's Diane Francis, all one word, substack.com. She is also the editor at large at the National Post. and her work can be seen in many post-meeting newspapers weekly. She has also written pieces for so many newspapers over the years. So it's really an honor for us to have her speak to our community directly. Again, she has spoken before, but right now, as everybody is in a total tizzy with confusion, because as Jerry said, so many things are happening very quickly. Diane, I wonder if you can give us a little context about what we're actually seeing right now in the world.
Okay, I'm not going to cover. Jerry did an excellent job summarizing the state of the nation as far as the electoral results and what they kind of mean in an American terms. I want to look at something else, which I think is very interesting. To use a sports metaphor, the field is very much in motion. The minute Trump got elected, everybody who's directly affected outside of the United States has been busily cobbling together strategies and plans, and that includes the Zelensky government. What I think they've realized is that when you're dealing with the Trump, who, by the way, and I wrote about this recently, is uniquely capable of standing up to Putin. He's a bully, and Putin's a bully. So I want, I hope that Trump realizes that, Putin is not only responsible for the mayhem in Ukraine, but he's also behind the mayhem in the Middle East, which is another problem he has to solve. And when he sits down at the table or has anything to say to Mr. Putin, he's got to nail him with the fact that, he trained the Hamas people that did the October 7th terrorist attack against Israel that started the whole thing. And it was in commemoration of his birthday. His birthday is October 7th. And they celebrated in Moscow over that terrible massacre. So this guy's got blood on his hands. He's a pariah and he's a mess. And that's where I want Trump to be Trump the bully. He's got to stand up to this and also realize that the United States is unbelievably powerful compared to Russia's a peanut in terms of economically and in terms of militarily to the United States. So I want him to use his backbone in this and to always remember that. All that being said, Europe and Ukraine are both tweaking very interesting proposals that are kind of leaking out here and there. And I think these will also embolden Trump to work very quickly with this and not forget the best interests of Ukraine in all of this, and also NATO and Europe. I think what you're seeing coming out of the Zelensky government are two proposals that are very interesting that apparently Trump has looked at, and according to indirect sources, he's interested and intrigued about. Number one is that, Ukraine is one of the 10 most resource-rich nations on Earth. The estimates are about $28 to $30 trillion worth of metals, minerals, oil, and gas. Offshore gas and oil reserves are massive around Crimea, which is why, of course, Putin wanted to grab them. And now Putin is zeroing in on the central part in the Dnipro area of Ukraine where the oil and gas production is. And it's interesting to note that even during this war, they were able to meet their own oil and gas needs. This is a very rich country. And basically, I think that the proposition is to a Trump, who's a deal maker and a businessman, is America will have first dibs on access and partnerships in exploiting Ukraine's incredible resource endowment in exchange for what they've done and going forward. I think that's a very compelling, positive message. Apparently also Zelensky has said, look, we have a very crack military machine now. And if you want us to take over, put our boots on the ground instead of American boots on the ground at NATO postings or wherever you want us to serve, we would be willing to take that headache away from you. Also a compelling benefit. So essentially, Trump never wants to be a loser. And they're trying to turn, what is now considered a nasty burden they've inherited from Biden to a winning proposition. Oh my goodness. We could have this war ended, which everybody would be happy about from a humanitarian point of view. We could also bolster the security of NATO and Europe and the world in general. We could stop Putin because he's horrible. And a lot of things are coming to bear there. Europe is also coming up with interesting possibilities. Europe can say to Trump, look, we know that you've done a wonderful thing for all of us by supporting Ukraine's struggle. We are going to double our defense budgets, as you have said we should have done all along. And I guess what else? We are also going to buy all of our LNG from America, which would erase the annual trade deficit between the United States and Europe. So there are a lot of goodies that Trump could walk away and take credit for having obtained, and at the same time, solve a war. So, the field is in motion. I'm very pessimistic about things, the status quo as it is. Obviously, that can't continue. And I'm not too happy about the bad advice he's given and these Republicans who spout nothing but a lot of Russian talking points. But the idea that Zelensky is packaging, as is Europe, benefits for the United States, which are frankly fair and just because they did step up to solve this problem, I think makes it very interesting. And that, of course, would mean, therefore, that Trump would say to Putin, look, we're not ceding any more property. You're going to behave yourself. And you're not going to, and so on. And they can join NATO if they want to. Yeah, I mean, he's going to have to sort of take Ukraine's part because he will now come out somewhat as a winner. It sounds, crass and commercial, but at the end of the day, Americans have put up a lot of their hard-earned tax dollars to help this country that many Americans couldn't even find on a map. So I think we have to realize that that's what's going to happen, and Ukraine is they get it, they understand it. So I think we're not talking about a business transaction. We're talking about a geopolitical solution that has baked into it win-win. That's my hope.
Thank you, Dan. Again, too much food for thought. I have so many questions immediately for all of you, following up on all of these wonderful remarks. But I'm going to allow Michael to start the conversation amongst the three of you. We do have 2 questions that have been written in that I'll bring up after our speakers begin speaking amongst themselves, as well as Maria, the head of our Illinois division, just sent in a question on chat. So I'll be gathering any questions, and please do, if you're watching this either on YouTube, Facebook, or on Zoom with us, do submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Because again, we've just seen the gamut of how much we're talking about. I think, apart from Antarctica, I don't think Jerry skipped over a significant portion of the world. But I do want to point out that your friend Peter Taluk pointed out in the chat that that Matt Dolan from the Chicago State House is also a strong Ukraine supporter, because you listed all the wonderful supporters that you can find in today's Republican Party in Ohio. Mikhailo, do you have anything in particular to kick this off with?
In particular, nothing in particular, but I wanted to follow up on 2 things. One that Jerry had mentioned in terms of, again, the list of countries and how they should be focused in on, or they are focused in on, the war in Ukraine. But there's also something, this phrase that's going around, used to be in the George W. Bush era, used to be called the axis of evil, where you had Cuba, Syria, Iran, and North Korea. Now it's actually expanded to another notion. It's called the axis of autocracies, which includes the 4 that I had just mentioned, includes the Chinas of the world, the Russias of the world, and expands further from Venezuela and so forth and so on. how do we deal with expanding the notion of why it is necessary for these democracies that are literally under threat? You had mentioned that Japan is very concerned about what's happening in Ukraine right now. Japan obviously being off the Russian shore in the Sea of Japan, not too far from China, not too far from Taiwan. How do we get all these democracies united in this existential fight when it comes to democratic principles and values? And to Diane, one of the things as well, which we're working here in Congress in Washington, you had mentioned that Ukraine is extremely resource rich. And whether this administration sees that, whether a future administration sees that, but there are attempts right now to actually try to maneuver the United States right now in a good position with Ukraine. And Senator Blumenthal and Senator Graham returned from Ukraine in August, and immediately upon their return, they authored a bill called the Stand with Ukraine bill, which basically will help to promote U.S. and Ukraine business opportunities. That includes what you had mentioned, the oil reserves that Ukraine has, the lithium which Ukraine has, which other than outside of China or outside of several African countries, is an essential for anything that we have here when it comes to cell phones. How do we expand upon that in terms of where can we go from here? One of the opportunities that I see for us as a Ukrainian American community is interaction with Ukraine, and in particular with the Embassy of Ukraine in Washington, D.C., is they've enacted what is called the state to oblast relationship. What used to be, in a sense, like a sister city, now it's called state to oblast. And this could be a very good opportunity for a particular state in the United States to partner with an oblast in Ukraine to help develop those crucial resources that are necessary for world development. Good for the United States, obviously good for Ukraine, but good for the world in particular. So maybe if we can kind of combine that, those two thoughts, access of autocracies, and how do we continue with the present enrichment of Ukraine when it comes to its economic development?
So
Jerry?
okay, sorry.
I'm thinking about it. It's a hard question you posed in terms of the range of potential supporters I named. It's hard to see how you get them, let's say, physically in one place. I don't think that's going to happen. I guess I'd focus first on some institutions that already exist. So probably G7, for instance, maybe G20. I forget who's all in G20. Take advantage of those and be sure you've got people telling the story, whatever, billboards on the streets, newspaper articles, so that the delegates see that and begin to put in their mind, this has got something to do with me. This is not Ukraine's battle. It's really a global struggle. The other would be to really tap into the disaster of Ukrainians and identify, well, who is in Japan and who is maybe got access to top leaders, who is in India and has done business with India. I would begin to almost to pinpoint relationships first to try to build the bridges, get the connections going so that as this develops, you've got a line of communication, a way to insert your message.
I'm going to quickly, if you don't mind, Andrei, sorry about that. Jerry, I think that's a wonderful idea. And actually, as a matter of fact, I think we could also start with some of those diaspora communities here in the United States.
Yes.
They have those connections directly with the countries of their forefathers and so forth. So I think that's a great suggestion, and definitely we'll follow up on that. Diane, also one other thing I forgot to mention in terms of the economic development of Ukraine. One of the things is Kaja Kallas, who was the High Representative and Vice President of Foreign Affairs within the EU Council, has been advocating, or just recently came out yesterday, 2 days ago, just came out, advocating for the freezing of Russian assets, sovereign assets, which is over 300 billion euro, not just dollars, but euro, using all of that, not just the interest payments, but using the actual principal payments to help for the reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine as well. So maybe we can use those 300 billion euros of Russian sovereign assets along with economic development in Ukraine. There's your reconstruction and recovery plan right there.
Yeah, I think that the 300 billion is a little tricky for the Europeans because they feel that it will unsettle confidence in the euro if they're stealing money from people who use euros that they happen to oppose. So they've got to maneuver that. But we're talking about $500 billion worth of damage. Ukraine has been decimated. And I think that the Marshall Plan, that there will have to be a Marshall Plan, but there can't be a Marshall Plan until there's a deal, because no one will insure or take the chance in a war zone to rebuild anything. And so you've got to get the deal first. And that's why I think the economic upside and giving the Americans the edge on that because of their financial help and their other help for Ukraine is going to would be key to getting this settled, and Trump taking a very tough time with and being very tough with Putin. And whether it's an armistice type deal like Korea has, or whatever, a ceasefire with guards. But the thing is that once you establish there's an upside for Americans particularly, they will flood in, the multinationals, because there will be a sort of a blessing and endorsement, a safety factor. Germany and the others will write the checks to rebuild the infrastructure because they have to, because of Ukraine's sacrifices. So I have no doubt that if this sort of thing, and I'm not talking about stealing the assets from the Ukrainian people, these are their assets. I'm talking about inviting in your allies who you owe everything to help you develop it with along with you and your companies. So I think that you have to have the framework, though, because right now it's quite chaotic, and that can happen. And once that happens, Ukraine will rebuild itself in no time. And I think that this will be a win-win for everybody. And Trump can see that kind of big picture. He's a business guy. He wants to make a deal, and he wants to turn a burden into a prize.
I'm reading a lot of questions that a lot of our speakers have already touched on, especially the matter of the frozen assets. Maria Flynn wrote in about that. I think that Diane pointed out the European position. I think conversely, it doesn't really help that the majority of funds are situated and frozen in Europe. And so conversely, what the United States can do for those assets, that's not a lot of assets in the United States. So Diane pointed out that the bulk of the assets which are in Europe are the ones that the leaders of the countries have the least interest in moving.
But I will also say that the fact that they're just frozen is a bargaining chip.
Yes.
Something you hold over Putin's head. And you say, you know what, you don't want a cent of that. You're going to do this and you're not going to do that. So I think that the economic upside that the Zelensky government and the Europeans are now understanding is going to break through all of the diplomacy and the politics involved, and will actually overwhelm Putin in terms of, he can't stop this wall of interest in sorting this out and telling him to behave himself.
A lot of people have commented on a lot of these topics. I'd like to jump and combine two comments or questions. One from our wonderful Westchester branch, Oksana, asking if the peace deal, the prospective peace deal coming out of the Trump administration isn't good for Ukraine, why is it assumed that Ukraine will be forced to capitulate and take the deal? But also there was a brand new comment because we've been talking about, or Diane mentioned reconstruction, all the things that need to happen. Somebody just mentioned, is it Christina, just mentioned that she doesn't hear anything in our discussion that constitutes punishment for Russia. So will there be any kind of punishment for Russia for unlawfully taking territory? I think this is a big conversation all over the world. What are the ramifications and how? Yeah.
But I mentioned, Andre, that one of the things I've written about, and I'm sure others have too, is that everybody is telling Trump, go right at him. I mean, he's done something egregious here. He has done something unforgivable. He cannot expect that he can get away with this, that he cannot come out a winner as a result of this, that whatever, and reparations are due, for goodness sakes. And the moral authority is there. And I think with the economic benefit behind that moral authority, I think that Putin does not have an argument. And yes, he should be treated like the war criminal and monster that he is. There's no question. That should be the tone. This is not about, oh, let's make a deal and let's just put our weapons down and kiss and hug. No way. He's a monster.
I
Gary.
think I think that's a tough view to take if you want a settlement. If you have unconditional surrender like we had in World War II, where you basically decimated the enemy, you could get those terms. But that's not the situation today. We have not, and probably will not because of nuclear weapons, attempt to decimate Russia. So I think the hard truth is that you'll have to find a way to allow Putin to have, call it save face at a minimum, preserve himself. There's no indication that the Russians want to take him out of office. So I think if you're going to do a bargain, as Trump would do, and Trump besides likes Putin, so we got that additional problem. If you're going to do a real bargain, I think we got to be realistic. You're going to have to swallow a lot of grief about Putin to get the deals you're talking about.
And do you think that would be a requirement? Will they, for instance?
So let him
go ahead.
Let him keep the 20%.
Yeah, I think I don't see I don't see what it is that you use as leverage to say he can't have it. I mean, who's going to push him out?
But you've got to be tough and make sure that there's no way that's it then.
That's what I said. Your border security is a fundamental issue here. How realistically strong is it, and can it be sustained? Because you can sustain borders. We've had East and West Germany. We've had North and South Korea. There's lots of places where you've had wars and then you settle them and do not rekindle the battle. There are other places where you have, so it's a tough call. But I just think there's lots of reasons to be totally angry at Putin for what he's done, but the realistic power balance is, I don't see how we enforce all that you described. That's really essentially a recipe for saying we'll continue to fight and fight and fight, and Trump says he doesn't want to continue to fight and fight and fight.
I think one of the you mentioned earlier about the not this I keep doing Ukrainian interviews. The pressure that needs to be put on from the international community, Jerry. And you brought up the G20. That's happening this month. That's happening in Brazil, and this is another instance like we had with the BRICS summits over the past 2 years, and the international warrant for Putin. That is another red line or a marker to see how the international community behaves. I think so far Russia has indicated that Putin would spare the embarrassment for Brazil by not attending, but it's always possible that he would push the limit and see if Brazil would actually turn an internationally wanted war criminal over. And that's probably another piece of discussion. Diane mentioned the territory, but there's a lot of other repercussions that Russia would be bargaining for, right? It's international sanctions, it's market access, it's a whole slew of things, not least of which is Putin is not allowed in the majority of the world right now.
Yep. Well, I think that these convocations are one place where you want to be sure the message comes across, whether it's through editorials in the local papers, whether it's in billboards, whether it's in demonstrations, whether it's lobbying. I would not let the issue drop off the agenda. I think you make it part of the agenda in any way you can, and to keep uniting global opinion, to say at a minimum end this. I realize from Ukraine's side, it's got to be more than just end it. It's got to be and give us security, give us reconstruction, etc. But at least get the world to say we're putting pressure on Russia to find a solution that satisfies both sides.
Michael, can I turn to you for this last thing? Because beginning with Maria's question, probably one of the first comments we had, and then with some other questions as well, there has been a return to what are effective messaging? What do we need to do? Maria's question ended about advocacy tips for the lame duck session advocacy. You began by saying, Michaela, in your remarks, that there's so much stuff that still needs to be done before the end of the year. Let's remind people what that is, and also, you know, what are going to be the talking points. As we mentioned, this month we will have the G20, we will have the 1000th day, we will have Holodomor Remembrance. We go into December with a possible budget shutdown, the lame duck session ending, and then still time before the inauguration for more legislation to possibly be enacted, as well as, don't forget, brand new members of Congress and Senate. How do we effectively message? There's a lot on the table for us.
There truly is a lot for us to be developing between now and say January 20th. And I'll start with the latter part that you had mentioned, Andrei, and that is there are over 55 to 60 open seats in Congress that were just filled in last week's election. Brand new members of Congress, not members that have been reelected, not members that switched from one house into another house, absolutely brand new members, which unfortunately many of them maybe do not know about Ukraine. So this is our opportunity as a Ukrainian American community in terms of the advocacy that we do, is to inform them, first of all, about a community that exists as constituents that exist within a respective congressional district, but obviously to inform them about the various issues. One of the issues that I actually forgot to mention, which is of deep importance as well, significant importance, is the possibilities for for deep strikes of American weapons into Ukraine. That obviously has to be first and foremost, even before a presidential drawdown authority, because Ukraine already has these weapons in stock. They're already in country. They're ready to be used and can be used effectively. And obviously that will help in terms of the diminishment of the destruction of Ukrainian civilian and military personnel in Ukraine, as these rockets, as these drones are constantly being thrown upon Ukraine. So I think that should be one of our first requirements within this lame duck period. Post-election lame duck, this is an administration issue, but we have a two-tactical and a two-pronged process tactically that we can do. A is to make sure that we get to the administration as much as possible through our phone calls, through our letter writing, and so forth, but also through our respective members of Congress, the ones that we know already, the ones we have excellent relationships with. Let's have them also be our sounding board for this potential use of weapons for deep strikes into Russia. And what I had mentioned earlier in terms of the economic development of Ukraine, there is a Stand with Ukraine bill out there. It's both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate right now. House of Representatives Bill 9501, Senate Bill 4992. Stand with Ukraine helps to promote U.S. Engagement with Ukraine for economic opportunities as well as for security guarantees. It helps to establish a border, what Jerry had mentioned earlier. All of these things are absolutely crucial as Ukraine moves forward in terms of building itself an opportunity for a greater bargaining chip when it comes to quote-unquote bargaining chip when it comes to any types of negotiations with Russia. Ukraine has to go into any type of negotiation, whether pressed by by the U.S. administration or by others. Ukraine has to go into any type of quote-unquote negotiations with Russia with an upper hand. And I think these could be those upper hands, given that, as Diane had mentioned, the 300 billion euros when it comes to the Russian sovereign assets, the deep strikes against Russia, and obviously a support with Ukraine bill in terms of giving economic opportunities for Ukraine, inherently starting with the United States of America
So Trump is going to appoint a special peace envoy, correct?
as well.
So that's critical. So who do we want that to be?
There,
That's what we should get behind.
we could also we could get behind that, and actually what Jerry had mentioned in terms of, yes, Governor DeWine has to mention and has to appoint a senator for the next 2 years to replace Senator J.D.
Yep.
Vance as he takes the oath of office on January 20th. So that could be our opportunity to interact with a Governor DeWine. This could be our opportunity to interact with anyone within the Trump transition team, to put a person that is well known for Ukraine in this peace envoy, or whatever that the special envoy, whatever the title is given to that particular official, but somebody that obviously has their pulse on what is going on in Ukraine and understands us as a community and all of our concerns.
I would, on the issue of, first, that's an excellent idea, both of them. And first, I want to compliment Diane. I think the idea of featuring Trump's ability to do a desire to do a deal, and to put in front of him a deal that is almost he can't turn down because it's so good for America and he looks so good, I think is psychologically and actually practically, that's the big play. In the interim, another person to probably check in with is Penny Pritzker. Penny got the assignment to be the Reconstruction czar. We met all in Washington a year and a half ago now and talked a lot about how to fund Reconstruction, who would do it, how to handle the insurance, the works. She was very adamant that she wanted to begin Reconstruction even during the war. Two, I haven't heard much from her recently, but she must be inside the inner circles and she must have some ideas of where the touch points and the power points are that will really shift Trump's view of what a settlement ought to look like. So I'd find out what Penny's thinking. And she also leads to a powerful governor, her brother. So there's a double reason to want to be sure Penny's thinking about this and adding her value to the negotiations.
Great
I take
people.
I take the Penny Pritzker suggestion. Thank you very much. And I also saw in the comments section that Brian Hook seems to be the name that's being floated for a special envoy, for a peace envoy for Ukraine. Brian, I know of Brian. He used to work for the Romney campaign. He also used to work at the State Department for Trump, the Trump administration. So this could be an opportunity to try to interact with him again. Having that direct contact is what's key right now. And when mentioning Penny Pritzker, yes, we're very fortunate to have a very strong community in Illinois, which has a very good relationship with the current governor. So I think that could be mended and helped to help mend these ties with Penny herself.
Great. We do have a bunch more questions. I think the bulk of people who we haven't answered are the people who look at the everyday news and the hair on fire assessments that drive news ratings up. We know this, and this is why we get the phone calls from all the international news stations wanting us to comment on things. And Mikhailo's been doing this for a very long time. All of our special guests here have been involved in geopolitical affairs for the majority of their lives. So knowing and understanding, I think, for our public and our community, to not constantly be chasing the dangling keys that are put in front of your face. There are a lot of things that we cannot do, either as a community or even if you headed the largest corporation in the United States, to prevent somebody from being a cabinet member if you simply don't like that person from being a member of the cabinet. However, there are long-term strategies that are always beneficial for us. For instance, Mikhaila, I know that for the last several administrations, you've personally authored letters of recommendation to the various Senate committees that have the responsibility for oversight. So sometimes there are people who we really like from any administration, whether that's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, maybe even other positions who have a longstanding community relationship, that we will try to do our best to elevate our community by showing that we are willing to work with people as opposed to standing against people, in the sense that it's always better to work with a little bit of honey, Mikhaila, as opposed to all the agitation against it. Not that there isn't a place for agitation and doing focused advocacy and or even protests. All of this is a part of the American system, but I know that there's a lot of people really concerned. Can I just ask both of our speakers and even Mikhaila, what is a long-term, after the end of the year, what would a good campaign, if you were planning an advocacy campaign, what would the structure of that campaign be? What would be the metrics that you'd be looking at, Jerry? Is it number of people who've joined the caucus, number of people perhaps who visited Ukraine, newly elected members of Congress? What would give you a sense that Ukraine would be back on its way up as a top priority for any American administration, whether that's a Republican or Democratic Congress? We still don't know how that's going to work out in the House. But no matter what happens, what would be the metrics that we'd be looking at?
Well, I'm thinking that, again, I'm picking up on Diane's thoughts about the assets of Ukraine, which I also mentioned. In some ways, it would be the metric I'd get is to have Ukraine more and more convey to the world the benefits it brings to the world if it survives as an independent nation. So that's food, the minerals and resources described, it's the intellectual capacity. To realize there's an asset here that's more than just the territory. I mean, Putin, because he's bombing everything, seems to almost be destroying what is the heart of Ukraine. So he's not turning it into an asset. He's turning it into this devastation. So I think I would first make clear there's more here than just the war going on. There's an asset for the world, and play that hard. The more practical question is the one you're raising, which is, can you talk to people like Mike Johnson got talked to and got convinced to come on board? So it may be one-on-one, you can actually tell the story graphically enough and sincerely enough that they say, actually, I wasn't there, but I will be there because I see why. That's a one-on-one effort that you got to really spend some time on to convert people like that, especially this new crop that got elected.
Mikhaila, Jerry, I don't know the status of his arm, but he served a nice fat pitch over the plate for you to talk about meeting with people. Is there anything we can talk about with our community that you think will be a good opportunity in the coming weeks and or the beginning of 2025 to meet with people?
Well, I'd like to actually go back to your question that you had mentioned and asked of Jerry, something that we can do as an organized Ukrainian community. And I think it's something we're a little bit lax on, and something that we need to build our own resources here as a community is to be involved within our own political system here in the United States. I think it's key for us to become members of our local Democratic or local Republican parties on a local basis, on a statewide basis. As I said in my opening remarks, all politics is local, as former speaker had mentioned. So for that, I think this is that groundswell, right? Everything begins from the ground up. Diane, obviously, as a blogger, knows very well in terms of how information gets disseminated. It's not so much, even Andrei, what you had mentioned, there's a lot of information out there, and everybody is digesting all of this information as much as they can, from the Wall Street Journals of the world to the Washington Posts to the New York Times of the world. But it's those local newspapers, it's those local media outlets, I think, that we kind of forget along the way. And those are the ones, if you look at the electoral map of the United States as of last week, we have a coastline on the east and on the west, which are primarily blue, and everything on the middle seems to be primarily red. So in general terms speaking here. So I think what we need to do is actually become a little bit more involved when it comes to our own electoral system here. our own party system, political system, and therefore make our concerns that much more known within the parties from the internal aspect. As regards to what we see coming up in a new Congress in 2025, the continuation of all of our advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C., with members of the Senate, with members of the House of Representatives. But also, again, I must reiterate that this is not just on a local basis, on a federal basis. We need to do this on a local and a state basis. This helps to build that type of portfolio that we have of a strong and united and unified community when it comes to the situation of the United States being a strategic partner of the United States, again, in the national interest of the United States, as well as in Ukraine's interest for security purposes. So looking forward of 2025, there's much that we can discuss. We must continue discussing security guarantees for Ukraine. It's not a matter of just a quote-unquote peace deal. There has to be security guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine went through this, unfortunately, in 1994. It was not successful when it came to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, signed by 4 particular countries. Here is an opportunity to truly have a peace negotiation, a settlement, and security that comes from Ukraine. I saw in one of the comments that Russia, from one of the participants, that Russia basically has to be defeated for it to not be a threat to world democracies. And that's always something that we have mentioned as a Ukrainian community. Frankly speaking, I was very outspoken at the early stages of the war with the Biden administration, that they failed to mention who the enemy was here. And the enemy that we see is Russian imperialism. The enemy that we see, obviously, is the Kremlin itself, for what it has done for Ukraine, for what the Ukrainian Americans know in the history of Ukraine for the past 400 years. Other countries in the region know exactly the same thing for centuries, for decades and centuries as well. So unless we actually commit ourselves to knowing who the enemy is, it makes it very, very difficult at times defining who the enemy is, makes it very difficult to come out with a strategic plan of victory. So I think before we put the cart before the horse, let's make sure that we know what the victory plan is. We have to recognize who the enemy is and defeat the enemy as quickly and as vociferously as possible.
Hey, Andre, picking up on what Mikhail is talking about, the one area we haven't discussed is using or working with retired military generals and admirals, especially, that have been inside the Pentagon. I think they could help articulate what was needed for secure borders. They could articulate what the implications are for other fronts, because you do have China watching all of this, thinking about what they do with Taiwan. You've got potentially North Korea thinking about what it does with South Korea. So those are far more conflicts than the U.S. wants to have. So those admirals and generals, most of them are going to say supporting Ukraine is fundamental to reducing the risk to the United States around the world. And I'd get a group of 10 or 15 at least that said that a lot, and maybe came with you on some of the congressional calls.
Jerry, on behalf of the UCCA, I'd love to work with you to see whether we can get a group of former generals and military experts together into some type of advisory council for the UCCA for our advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. We had already done this with former members of Congress. Last year we formed, or at the beginning of this year, we formed what is called the Congressional Ukraine Advisory Group, which is of former members of Congress, former senators, former members of the House of Representatives, whether Democrat, Republican, on a bipartisan basis. Both are going to be needed, as they themselves know, in a sense, how the sausage is made from the inside. They still have their context. They still have a lot of interaction with the current members of Congress, and they might even help us with the new members of Congress. So we need to expand that particular group. Let's form another group when it comes to the military advisors. Senator Portman has agreed to be the co-chair of the Congressional Ukraine Advisory Group. We had mentioned him in the past. Jerry, you mentioned him in your opening remarks. He's a great friend of Ukraine. That's exactly what we need to do, is we need to utilize a lot of these resources that haven't been utilized before. This is of the benefit, again, of the United States and for Ukraine.
I don't want to keep everybody here too long. I know Dan's been on the TV from the morning till night. I know Jerry's been all over the place. And Mikhailo, you have a busy day as it is door knocking time tomorrow with everybody back in town. With that said, I believe that we had such a great time tonight. So many people have tuned in both online and registered in advance. We also had a wonderful session of our community organizing, including with UCCA, but a bunch of other pre-election webinars. Mikhailo, I think would be good to have another one of these post-election webinars after Thanksgiving. So if everybody wants to maybe save the date or the first Wednesday after Thanksgiving, and we'll send out information thereafter. But before that time, remember what Mikhailo said, there's plenty of time to interact with newly elected members, existing members, maybe some people who are in this golden time of they're on their way out the door in January, but you know what? There's a couple of more votes they have to give. Let's make sure we rack up those people to sign up on a bunch of wonderful initiatives, hopefully. As we all mentioned, there's a lot of international affairs happening with the G20, possibly President Biden doing a concluding leaders level meeting of Ramstein. If that happens, that'll be another advocacy point to get those long range rockets. And if we listen to Jerry, it's a possibility that there might be more hot action coming out of Ukraine if Ukraine is thinking strategically to get to the best position before coming to the negotiating table. So there's a lot to think of in the coming weeks. And I think, as we all are aware, it's this conversation that hopefully answers some questions. I know people want specifics. If you go to ucca.org/Eunice, every single bill that Mikhailo mentioned is in the archived emails that he has. So back in August, he was talking about the Let Ukraine Strike initiative, contact the White House. Back in October, the next bill that you mentioned,
Stand with Ukraine.
Stand with Ukraine. That's also the name of the bill is all there. Just go to the website and look for Eunice's archived emails. You can check them in your email box. You can also go to UCCA's webpage, and we archive all of Mikhailo's alerts, his action alerts that go out. So if you've missed a particular bill, you're able to check his infographic that is put out, as well as any link information. So in between now and then, I wish everybody to have a happy and blessed time at the rest of this month. We have Thanksgiving coming up. Please remember to do what your community normally does, maybe on a slightly bigger level, for acknowledging the innocent deaths of the victim of genocide this month, especially with the victims of the Holodomor, which both in the United States and throughout the world will be honoring specifically on November 23rd. But many communities have already did the local events. And if you look at ucca.org, there's an entire page dedicated to all the local events that you have sent in to us, minus our wonderful branch in Georgia and centered in Atlanta, who just sent their event to me today, which will be happening on November 24th. I will put that right on the website. These are wonderful opportunities to include members of Congress, and as much as possible, we also encourage you, if you haven't worked with people across the aisle, this is a wonderful time in this wonderful lame duck session to try to invite as many people as possible to your events. Maybe your regular standing congressman who has come to things, but try to reach across the aisle, whether that's you're in a Republican area reaching for a Democrat, or a Democratic area reaching towards a Republican. Let's get as much bipartisan work as possible done. That only helps Mikhailo, that only helps our advocates, whatever summits and actions we might have in the spring. But I encourage all of you to keep your head on high. Let's have a game plan. We had some wonderful speakers here who know a little bit about success and advocating for a concise narrative that can change people's minds. So with that in mind, you can rewatch all of this on YouTube and on Facebook. The people who signed up for this will get an email tomorrow with the recorded link on Zoom, so you can even look at all the chat messages on the recorded link on Zoom. And we will try to have another post-election webinar as we get more and more information, more and more of these nominees to be in the cabinet or other special posts, as we just heard today, potential special envoy in the vein of a Kurt Volker that we had in the first Trump administration. All of these updates we will be watching online, and hopefully we can discuss them after the Thanksgiving holiday. Thank you very much for joining us. I thank you, Jerry. I thank you, Diane. I hope to see you at an upcoming event. Mikhaila, thank you very much for taking part as well.
Thank you. Thank you,
My
Andrei,
pleasure.
for moderating. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
And good fortune.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone.